Chapter 1: The Fog of Whitechapel. London, October 1888. The fog came in from the Thames each evening like a living thing, slow, deliberate, hungry. It wrapped itself around the gas lamps until their light was reduced to a sickly amber smear, barely enough to illuminate a man's outstretched hand. It swallowed the sound of horse hooves on cobblestone, muffled the distant cry of a newspaper boy, and turned every narrow alleyway in Whitechapel into a passage leading nowhere good. Amy Whitmore had lived in Whitechapel all her 24 years, and she had never feared the fog before, not until this autumn. The murders had begun in August. 5 women in 10 weeks, seamstresses, flower sellers, women of the street, each one taken in the dark and left in a condition the newspapers described only in the most cautious terms, as if the very ink on the page might be contaminated by too much truth. The police had no name for the killer yet, though the broadsheets had taken it upon themselves to supply one. Letters had been sent, or claimed to be sent, by the perpetrator himself. Taunting letters. Mocking letters. Letters signed with a name that Amy found herself unable to speak aloud, even in the privacy of her own mind. The East End had always known violence. It was a neighbourhood built on the sharp edges of poverty, where a man might be robbed at the corner of Commercial Street in broad daylight, where children went hungry while their fathers drank themselves into a stupor at the 10 bells. Amy understood the cruelty of want. What she did not understand, what none of them understood, was this new cruelty. This cruelty that seemed to operate without logic, without motive that anyone could name. He chose women who were already invisible. That was what terrified Amy the most. She pulled her shawl tighter and quickened her pace along Dorset Street, her workbag tucked beneath her arm. She had stayed late at Mrs. Hartley's dress shop, finishing the hem of a wedding gown for a Kensington bride who would never set foot in Whitechapel, who did not know that the hands stitching her happiness belonged to a woman who had to count her steps home in the dark and pray. The gas lamps were lit, but they were little comfort. The fog had come early tonight, thicker than usual, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and the river and something else, something damp and ancient that Amy had no name for. The street was not empty, it never truly was, even at this hour. A group of women stood outside the lodging house on the corner, talking in low voices, their faces drawn. 2 men argued outside a pub, their voices muffled by the fog. A cart horse stood motionless beside a trough, patient as stone. Amy recognized the shape of her neighborhood, the way she might recognize the lines of a face she had known since childhood, and yet tonight everything felt different. Tonight the familiar felt foreign, as though the fog had replaced her streets with imitations of themselves. She was nearly to the corner of Miller's Court when she heard the sound. It was nothing remarkable in retrospect. A sharp crack like wood splintering, followed by a cascade of something breaking. Glass, perhaps, or crockery. It came from the narrow passage between 2 tenement buildings, the kind of passage that had no name and no purpose except to connect one darkness to another. Amy slowed. Her sensible mind told her to keep walking, to not turn her head, to fix her eyes on the amber smear of the lamp at the corner, and walk toward it without stopping. Her less sensible mind stopped her feet entirely. She could hear, now that she was listening, a sound beneath the silence, a low, rhythmic tapping that might have been footsteps, might have been something dragged across cobblestone, might have been nothing more than a cat investigating an overturned bin. Amy stood very still in the swirling fog, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and she listened. The tapping stopped. Then, from the darkness of the passage, a figure appeared. She almost cried out. The sound died in her throat as the figure resolved into a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat and hat that had seen better days. He was carrying what appeared to be a black medical bag, and he walked with the distracted, purposeful gait of someone who had somewhere to be and was running slightly behind. He did not seem, at first, to notice Amy standing in his path. Then he looked up. The gas lamp at the corner illuminated his face for just a moment before the fog shifted and dimmed it again. A strong jaw, dark eyes that caught the light with an unusual intensity, the kind of face that belonged in a drawing room rather than Dorset Street at 10 o'clock on a foggy October evening. He was perhaps 30, perhaps 35, it was difficult to say. He wore his years lightly, the way some men did, as though time had not yet made up its mind about him. He stopped when he saw her. Forgive me, he said. His voice was low, educated, not the clipped vowels of the East End, but the rounded tones of a man who had been to school, who had read books. I did not see you there, Amy found her voice, nor are you . A pause, the fog moved between them like a third presence. It is late, he said, and there was something in his tone that she could not quite read. Not a warning exactly, not a question, something more like an observation that contained within it the weight of everything that had happened in Whitechapel that autumn. Yes, Amy agreed, it is, He looked at her for a moment longer, that steady, dark gaze that she could not fully see but could somehow feel, like pressure behind her sternum, and then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost old-fashioned in its courtesy. Evening, he said, and walked past her into the fog. Amy stood for a long moment without moving. She watched the darkness where he had vanished. The fog closed behind him as completely as water closes behind a stone. She walked the rest of the way home without looking back. But later, lying awake in her narrow bed, while the wind pushed at the window glass, she found herself thinking not about the fog or the darkness or the sound from the passageway. She found herself thinking about those eyes. Chapter 2, The Stranger. 3 days passed before Amy saw him again. In those 3 days, the newspapers found a new reason to carry fear from house to house. A letter had been received by the Central News Agency, written in a careless, slanting hand that experts debated endlessly in print. The writer claimed responsibility for the murders. He offered details that the police had not yet released to the public. He said he was not finished. Amy read the letter, reproduced in the illustrated police news, in the window of the newsagents on Commercial Street, the way she read all the papers she could not afford to buy. She read it twice. Then she went to work and sewed 12 buttonholes into a gentleman's waistcoat without once thinking about what her hands were doing, which was how she knew the letter had disturbed her more than she wished to admit. It rained on the 3rd day, a cold, insistent rain that came sideways off the river and found every gap in every coat in Whitechapel. Amy left Mrs. Hartley's shop at 7:30 with a newspaper tucked inside her work bag, as protection for a bolt of lace. She was taking home to finish that evening, and she had made it no more than 50 yards before the wind turned and drove the rain directly into her face. She ducked into the doorway of a chandler's shop that had been closed for an hour at least, pressing herself against the door as though she could push her way through it by sheer force of will. The rain hammered the cobblestones and turned the gutters into small rivers. A horse at the corner had given up entirely on dignity and stood with its head down, enduring. I believe the rain intends to be thorough about it, Amy spun around. The man from the fog stood 3 feet away in the same doorway, his dark coat beaded with rain, his hat pushed back slightly on his head as though the weather had knocked it askew. He was looking at the street with an expression of mild resignation. She recognized him immediately, which surprised her. She had seen his face for no more than a moment in poor light 3 nights ago. She should not have been able to place him. And yet there was no uncertainty in her recognition. She knew him the way she knew the particular shade of a color she had seen only once, could have picked him from a crowd of 1,000. He turned and recognized her at the same moment, and something moved across his face, something quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. The woman from Dorset Street, he said. The man from the passageway, she replied, and then immediately wondered if she should have said that, if the reminder of where she had first seen him was wise or foolish. But he only smiled, and the smile transformed his face in a way she had not anticipated. It was a good smile, genuine in a way that was unusual, she thought, in a man who carried himself with such careful reserve, as though he did not smile often, and when he did, he meant it. Jonathan Blackwood, he said, touching his hat again in that old-fashioned way. At your service, for whatever service a man can render while trapped in a doorway by November rain in October, She hesitated only a moment, Amy Whitmore, Whitmore, he said her name the way some people said unfamiliar words, carefully with attention. You work near here, Hartley's dress shop, on the corner, she indicated the direction with a small gesture. Yourself, I have a practice. Surgery on Lemon Street, a pause. I do consultations some evenings for the charitable clinic on Flower and Dean Street. The poor cannot always afford daylight hours, A doctor then, that explained the medical bag. Amy found herself relaxing very slightly, though she held onto a thin wire of caution. A woman of her station and her neighbourhood learned early that a man's profession was no guarantee of his character. They stood side by side in the doorway and watched the rain for a few minutes in silence that was, Amy noted with some surprise, not uncomfortable. He had a quality of stillness about him that was rare in her experience. Most people she knew filled silence with chatter, with noise, as though they were afraid of what they might find in it. This man seemed entirely at ease in the quiet. Do you always walk alone at this? He asked eventually. I don't have a great deal of choice. He nodded as though this was an answer he had expected and did not judge. The area is not safe at present. The area has never been particularly safe. Amy said, with a lightness she did not entirely feel. At least now there are more police about. The police. Something moved in his voice, a note she couldn't identify, brief and vanishing. Yes, Maury police. The rain showed no sign of relenting. A wagon passed, its driver hunched miserably over the reins, and the splash it sent onto the pavement made both of them step back simultaneously, which struck Amy as absurdly funny, and she laughed before she could help herself. He turned to look at her when she laughed. His expression was, she searched for the word, and found it, startled, as though laughter was a sound he had not expected in this doorway on this street, in this particular autumn. Forgive me, she said, composing herself. Don't, he said simply. It was he paused. It was a good sound, When the rain finally eased to a drizzle, Amy gathered her bag and prepared to leave. He stepped out of the doorway first and looked both ways along the street, an unconscious protective gesture, she thought, or perhaps not so unconscious. Allow me to walk you to your street, Miss Whitmore. The gutters are treacherous in this light, She should have refused. Every sensible instinct she had developed over 24 years in Whitechapel told her to refuse. She accepted, and she could not fully explain to herself then or afterwards why. They walked the 4 blocks to her lodgings in a comfortable silence punctuated by occasional observation, the absurdity of a man trying to protect his hat in a wind that had no intention of respecting hats, a shop window that had dressed a mannequin in summer linen, despite the weather, the way the gas lamps each had their own particular colour, some leaning toward orange, some toward yellow, none of them quite the same. He noticed things. That was what she observed about him in those 4 blocks. He noticed things the way she did, the small, particular things that most people's eyes passed over entirely. It was an unusual quality in her experience. She was not sure whether it comforted her or unsettled her. At the door of her lodging house he touched his hat, and she thanked him, and that should have been the end of it. You be at Hartley's tomorrow, he asked, as she put her hand on the door. She turned. He was watching her with that steady, dark gaze, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Yes, she said. Perhaps I will see, he said, as though this were merely a possibility he was noting rather than an arrangement he was making. Amy went inside. She stood in the narrow hallway of her lodging house and listened to his footsteps on the cobblestones, steady, unhurried, fadding, until the fog absorbed them entirely. She thought about the note in his voice when she had mentioned the police, and she could not sleep for an hour. Chapter 3, Whispers of a Killer. The body was found on the 9th of November. Amy heard about it the way most people in Whitechapel heard about such things, not from the police who told them nothing, and not from the newspapers, which arrived hours later and full of things already known, but from the woman at the pump in the yard behind her lodging house, who had heard it from the butcher's boy, who had heard it from a constable who was not supposed to say anything but could not help himself. She had been a young woman, a seamstress or something like one, found in a room on Miller's Court, which was to say found less than 4 minutes' walk from Amy's own door, which was a proximity that turned the morning cold in a way the weather alone could not account for. Mrs. Beale, the landlady, came upstairs to make sure all her lodgers knew. She stood in Amy's doorway with the look of a woman who had been processing fear for so long it had become a kind of fuel, keeping her upright and moving when the alternative was to sit down and not get back up. You're not to go out after dark, Mrs. Beale said, as though this were a thing she had the authority to declare. Not for any reason, Not for nothing, backslash. Backslash Mrs. Beale I work until backslash. Backslash I know when you work, backslash the landlady's jaw set, backslash I'm telling you what I'm telling you. It's Miller's Court this time. Miller's Court Amy, that is not far backslash. Amy knew it was not far. She spent the rest of that morning in the shop with her hands moving through familiar motions, baste, pin, cut, sew, while her mind traced and retraced the route from her front door to the corner of Dorset Street, as though by examining the geography she could find some pattern, some meaning, some gap in the space between herself and the murders into which she could wedge the certainty that she was safe. She did not find such a gap. She sewed instead very neatly and did not speak unnecessarily. Jonathan Blackwood came to the shop at noon. She heard the bell above the door and looked up from her work, and there he was, his dark coat damp at the shoulders from the morning's rain, his hat in his hand, his eyes moving around the small shop with a physician's quick assessment that took in everything and showed nothing. When his gaze settled on her, something in his expression shifted. Whitmore backslash his voice was quieter than usual. Backslash I heard about Miller's Court. I wanted to be certain you were backslash he paused. Backslash I simply wanted to be certain backslash. Mrs. Hartley, who had been watching from behind the counter, with the careful attention of a woman who had seen girls make poor decisions, and was determined not to see it again on her premises, made a small sound that was not quite a cough. Backslash Dr. Blackwood, backslash Amy stood, setting aside the jacket she'd been lining. Backslash that is very kind, backslash. Backslash you are well, backslash. Backslash I am well, backslash she studied him. He looked, she thought, tired, the kind of tired that was deeper than a single night's poor sleep, the kind that lived behind the eyes. His face held a tension she had not noticed before, a quality of compression, as though he were holding a great many things in a very small space. Backslash and yourself, you look, backslash. Backslash quite well, backslash, he said, with a finality that was not quite curtness but was close to it. He stayed for 20 minutes, which was both longer and shorter than she expected. He sat in the chair that Mrs. Hartley pointed him to, that lady having decided, Amy noted with private amusement, that if she could not stop the doctor from visiting, she could at least supervise the visit, and they talked about nothing in particular. The quality of the October light, the price of coal that winter, a lecture on electrical science that was happening at the Working Men's Institute that Amy would have liked to attend if the hour were not impractical. He was easy to talk to, which she had not expected from a man of his reserve. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the same quality of complete attention she had noticed on their first meeting, as though what she said mattered in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. But twice during the conversation she caught him at something she could not name, a pause that lasted too long, a look that crossed his face and vanished before she could read it, something dark, something dense with an emotion she could not identify. Both times she found a reason to look away, to give him the privacy of the unobserved moment. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door, hat in hand. Backslash the police are no closer, backslash, he said, quietly enough that Mrs. Hartley could not hear. It was a statement, not a question. Backslash no, backslash Amy said, backslash they are not, backslash. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the street sounds of Whitechapel carried on their perpetual business, indifferent. Backslash it troubles me, backslash, he said, and there was something in the words that was more than the ordinary concern of a man for his neighbourhood, something more personal, more private. Backslash it troubles all of us, backslash Amy said. He looked at her steadily. Backslash yes, backslash he said, backslash I suppose it. He left. Mrs. Hartley spent the next 20 minutes finding reasons to pass Amy's workstation, examining completed work that required no examination, until Amy finally said, without looking up from her stitching, backslash he is a doctor, Mrs. Hartley, backslash. Backslash doctors, backslash Mrs. Hartley replied primly, backslash have been known to be things other than doctors, backslash. Amy had no answer for that. She bent her head over her work and listened to the street outside, and thought about the look on Jonathan Blackwood's face when he spoke about the murders, and the weight in his voice that she had heard and could not set aside. That night she dreamed of fog, and in the fog a figure moved, and the figure carried a black bag, and she could not see the face. Chapter 4 Flowers in the Dark. November deepened. The murders stopped, or at least, no new ones were reported, and the East End held its collective breath and waited with the taut, exhausted vigilance of a city that has been frightened for too long. Jonathan Blackwood came to the shop 3 more times that month, then 4 times in the first week of December. The visits settled into a shape that was not quite routine. Amy was too honest with herself to pretend it was accidental, and then into something that had no name she was prepared to give it, which was either a good sign or a warning sign, and she was not yet decided which. He brought her a book in the second week of November, a collection of essays on natural philosophy that he had seen in a second-hand bookshop on Aldgate and thought might interest her, based on her mention of the electrical lecture. She had received gifts from men before and knew exactly what they meant and what they expected in return. She held the book and looked at him and saw none of that, and this was either reassuring or alarming. She could not decide which. She read the book in 4 evenings, and returned it with the pages she had most valued marked with a scrap of lace ribbon, and the conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered topics from electrical theory to the nature of memory to whether the universe was fundamentally ordered or fundamentally chaotic. I think it is ordered, Jonathan said. He was leaning forward in the chair with an energy she had not seen in him before, his hat forgotten on the table, his hands moving as he talked. The appearance of chaos is simply the failure of our perception. Every effect has a cause. Every event obeys laws we have not yet discovered. But you are a doctor, Amy said. You must encounter the utterly random, a disease that strikes one person and spares another, a fall that kills a healthy man and leaves a frail one untouched. He was quiet for a moment. He said, what I mean is that I need the world to be ordered, whether it is or not. It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She noticed it and filed it away, with the same careful instinct that made her keep small pieces of particularly beautiful fabric, not knowing yet what she would do with them. He invited her to walk on Sunday afternoon. This was, she told herself, a reasonable and respectable thing, a walk in daylight on a Sunday being among the most unimpeachable activities a man and a woman could undertake together. She went. They walked from Whitechapel to Victoria Park, which was farther than she usually walked on her own but seemed natural with him, the distance simply the time it took for the conversation to arrive at where it was going. He knew a great deal. She had expected this from a doctor and a man of education, but what she had not expected was that his knowledge was not the kind that crowded out other people's ideas. He had opinions, strong ones, but he held them lightly, with a willingness to be argued out of them that she found both attractive and in some way she could not articulate poignant. As though the capacity for revision were a quality he valued above certainty, perhaps because certainty was a thing he found in too much supply elsewhere in his life. They stopped at a flower seller's cart near the edge of the park, a thin woman with red-knuckled hands and a coat too light for the weather. Jonathan bought a small bunch of white chrysanthemums without consulting Amy, and then, as though only then realizing what he'd done, turned and offered them to her with an expression that was almost uncertain. They are very practical flowers, he said. Amy took them. She held them by the stems and looked at him and found that she was, and this was an observation she noted with the part of her mind that preferred facts to feelings, entirely happy, in the uncomplicated way of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. It was a feeling she encountered rarely and trusted with appropriate caution. Thank you, she said. They walked back as the light failed, as the fog came up from the river, and the conversation turned to smaller things, the best streets to take in various weathers, the particular sound Whitechapel made on a Sunday evening, the habits of the grey cat that lived on the steps of St. Mary Matfelon, and accepted offerings from passers-by with the dignified condescension of royalty. At her door he paused, as he always did, and looked at her with that quality of attention she had never found in anyone else. Amy, it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it quietly, as though the word required some care in its handling, made something in her chest tighten. Jonathan, she met his eyes. He looked as though he intended to say something more than whatever small social remark would close the evening properly. Then the look passed, and he stepped back and touched his hat and said good night. She went inside with the chrysanthemums and put them in a glass of water and stood looking at them for a long time. She thought about his face in the moment before he'd stepped back, She thought about what she had seen there, something fierce and something sorrowful in equal measure, wound together so tightly they were indistinguishable. She thought, he is a man who carries something he has never put down. She thought, I would like to know what it is. She thought, that is either courage or foolishness, and I have never been able to tell the difference. Chapter 5 The Secret Life. There was a room in Jonathan Blackwood's surgery on Lemon Street that his patients never saw. It was behind the bookcase, not a secret door, nothing so theatrical as that, simply a storage room that he had repurposed, its existence unknown to Mrs. Coates, who came on Tuesdays to clean. Unknown to the young assistant who managed his appointments, unknown to the colleagues at Whitechapel Hospital, who considered him a precise and capable physician, a man of sound judgment and measured temperament. He spent time in that room at night. On the shelf above the narrow desk, a surgeon's case, black leather worn soft with handling, its clasps undone. Beside it, a collection of newspaper cuttings so extensive that he had begun to paste them onto a large sheet of paper in overlapping layers, dates and headlines and descriptions accumulating until the page was almost entirely covered. Some were marked with a fine pen in red ink, notes in a handwriting so small and precise it might have belonged to someone else. Jonathan Blackwood would stand before this arrangement on certain nights, still in his coat and hat, still carrying the smell of the streets on him, and he would look at it with the expression of a man doing arithmetic, working through a calculation that never quite resolved, that always produced a remainder, a number left over that had no place in the equation. He was not unaware of what he was. This was perhaps what set him apart from the simplified monster that the newspapers were constructing, that he did not exist in the comfort of self-delusion. He knew with the same clinical precision that allowed him to identify a disease from its symptoms exactly what had occurred. He had examined the evidence. He had followed the reasoning. The conclusion was inescapable, and he did not try to escape it. What he could not understand, what produced that perpetual remainder, that figure that would not resolve, was the part that came before, the part that the newspapers with their crude and breathless language reduced to pure malevolence. A monster, they said, a devil, a creature from beneath the surface of civilized life. And Jonathan, reading these descriptions in his hidden room, found that they were not wrong exactly, but that they were incomplete in a way that he found almost unbearable. Because the monster was not separate from the man. The monster was inside the man, and the man, here was the fact he could not reconcile, was someone who had loved his mother, who found genuine pleasure in a well-solved medical problem, who had given a book to a woman in a dress shop, because it reminded him of a conversation about light, who had stood at her door with chrysanthemums in his hand, and felt something he had not felt in years, and did not know what to do with. He spent those nights doing what he always did after, reading, writing, cataloguing, imposing order on his thoughts with the discipline that had sustained him since childhood, since the years that had made him what he was, years he did not often permit himself to examine directly, the way one does not look directly at a very bright light. His father had been a surgeon, a precise man, a man who believed in the anatomy of everything, who had dissected not only bodies but ideas, emotions, relationships, who had taught his son that the human animal was a mechanism, and that mechanisms, properly understood, could be taken apart and reassembled in any configuration their operator chose. Jonathan had been a good student. There were hours in the days immediately following when he felt nothing at all, a blankness as clean and absolute as a page before any mark is made on it. And there were other hours when he felt a compression in his chest, so profound that he had to press his hand against his sternum to confirm that the ribcage was still structurally intact. He had not found a name for this sensation. He was not certain it had one. Amy Whitmore was the only exception he had ever encountered. He had not intended to approach her. He had passed her on Dorset Street that first evening in precisely the state of mind that made proximity to other human beings least advisable, and he had seen her standing in the fog like something recovered from a dream, and he had said good evening, and he had walked on, and he had thought about her eyes for 3 days after. Her laugh in the doorway during the rain had done something to the arithmetic in his mind. Not solved it, nothing would solve it, but briefly interrupted it, and the interruption had felt, for the duration of her laugh, like relief. He was not a fool. He understood the contradiction with perfect clarity, that he was a man who had made himself an instrument of extinction, now finding himself moved by the aliveness of a woman who sewed lace hems and read essays on natural philosophy, and walked through Whitechapel in the fog as though she had every right to be there. He did not intend to harm her. He was perfectly certain of this, and it was, he knew, a certainty that proved nothing about the future, because certainty had never once, in his experience, prevented the things it was certain would not happen. He stood in his hidden room on a cold December night and looked at the wall and thought about white chrysanthemums, and the thought was a clean and simple pain, like the pain of a cut made with a sharp blade. He should have left the city. He knew this. He had known it for months, had compiled in his precise physician's mind all the reasons to leave and all the means of doing so. He had made a mental inventory of the evidence against him, partial, circumstantial, nothing yet that would constitute proof in any court, and he had assessed the probability of discovery and found it acceptable. And yet he remained. He told himself it was because leaving would appear suspicious. He told himself it was because his practice could not be abandoned without notice. He told himself these things with great care and reasonable detail, and he believed none of them. He remained because of a woman who put a lace ribbon in the pages of an essay on natural philosophy to mark the passages that mattered to her, and this was, in the coldest and most clinical part of his mind, the most dangerous thing he had ever done. Chapter 6, The Missing Clue. She found it by accident. It was a Thursday in December, and Jonathan had come to walk her home from the shop. This had become, without discussion, an arrangement. He stopped at the door of Hartley's at 7:30, and Amy gathered her things and they walked. This was simply what happened. Amy did not examine it too closely, the way she did not examine too closely the way she looked forward to those walks from approximately 4 o'clock onward. She had asked that evening to stop at the chemist's on Whitechapel High Street, a small errand, a few minutes. Jonathan waited outside while she went in, and when she came out he was standing at the corner in conversation with a young constable she recognized from the neighborhood, a red-faced man named Doyle who had the permanently surprised expression of someone who had recently arrived at a situation he had not expected. The surgical knowledge required would not be inconsiderable, the constable was saying, with the strained deference of a man who has been buttonholed by someone of obvious education and is not sure whether to be grateful or suspicious. The inspectors have said as much. Whoever he is, he knows his anatomy. Jonathan made a sound that might have been agreement. Looking for a medical man they are, among others. Not that I should be telling you. The constable caught himself, noticed Amy's approach and straightened as though a string had been pulled. Evening, miss. Good evening. She looked at Jonathan, who had turned to face her with an expression that was perfectly ordinary. Mild, the expression of a man who has been having a casual street conversation, nothing more. They walked on. The conversation moved easily to other things, and Amy let it move and did not mention what she had heard. She did not think of it again until the following Saturday. She had gone to collect a book that Jonathan had promised to lend her, a natural history of the Thames, which she had expressed interest in for reasons she had then talked herself into believing were entirely intellectual. And Mrs. Coates was not in, and Jonathan himself came to the door, and the surgery behind him was in the slight disorder of a man whose cleaning woman had not yet arrived. He invited her into the front consulting room while he found the book. It was a businesslike room, examination table, instrument cabinet, bookshelves, a desk with patient records stacked in careful order. She stood by the bookshelves and read the spines with the idle interest of someone in a room they have not been in before. He had gone into the back of the surgery for several minutes. The book was apparently not where he expected it to be, and Amy, drifting along the bookshelves, was examining a row of medical journals when she noticed the door. It was slightly ajar. Behind it she could see a sliver of a darker room. She would not have looked further. She had been taught all her life that other people's private rooms deserved to remain private, and she held this principle with the firmness of someone who understood from personal experience what it was to have no private space at all. But the sliver of the room visible through the ajar door contained, catching the light from the consulting room, something red. She stood very still. She was not yet thinking. She was simply noticing, the way her eyes noticed things before her mind caught up and told her what to do with them. Red ink on paper, a page pasted over with newspaper clippings, specific dates in red circles, dates she recognized. The same dates, she realized slowly, as the dates of the Whitechapel murders. Here it is behind the anatomy of the spine, of all places. Jonathan's voice came from the back room, accompanied by the sound of footsteps. Amy moved back to the center of the consulting room with a speed she would not have thought herself capable of. She was standing by the window when he came through the door, and her breathing she was working very hard to ensure her breathing was entirely normal. The natural history of the Thames, he said, and held up the book with an expression of mild triumph. Wonderful, she said and smiled, and took the book from him, and stood there holding it while the warmth in his eyes made her feel something she was not prepared to feel, while she was also feeling what she was feeling about the room behind the bookcase. Are you? He asked. You? I am quite well, she said firmly. Thank you for the book, She left promptly and walked home quickly without thinking very carefully about why she was hurrying, and that night she lay in bed and constructed, with great methodical effort, the list of perfectly reasonable explanations for a doctor's collection of newspaper cuttings about a case that was on every front page in London. He was curious, he was professionally interested. Anatomy, as the constable had said, was a factor. He was collecting them as anyone might, as half of London was collecting them. The red circles around the dates meant nothing specific. She believed this. She was completely certain that she believed this. She fell asleep repeating it to herself like a prayer. She did not sleep well. Chapter 7, SHADOWS of Doubt. She began very quietly to keep a record. She told herself it was an exercise, an intellectual habit. A woman of her inclinations, trained from childhood to notice the particular and the specific, simply applying that training to the question of her own peace of mind. If she could demonstrate through careful observation that there was nothing to worry about, then she would stop worrying. She bought a small notebook, blue cardboard covers, from the newsagents on Commercial Street. She kept it inside the lining of her work bag, which she had unseamed slightly for the purpose, and which she restitched each morning before leaving her room. She began to note the times of Jonathan's visits against the dates she had memorized from the newspaper articles she now collected herself. She noted the occasions when he appeared tired in a way that seemed deeper than the tiredness of overwork. She noted the nights he had mentioned, offhandedly and at various times, that he had been walking, that he walked at night when he could not sleep, that he found the night air beneficial, that the streets of Whitechapel had a different quality after midnight that he found, in some way he didn't specify, clarifying. She found 2 overlaps in the first week. She told herself this meant nothing. 2 overlaps in a city where thousands of people were moving through the same streets on the same evenings. She turned the page and continued knotting. She began to read the newspaper accounts more carefully than she had before, with a different eye. An eye that was looking not for the horror of what had been done, but for the manner of it, the detail, the signature. She did not read these accounts pleasurably. She read them with the same grim necessity with which she had, as a child, looked at the wound in her hand when the needle slipped, forcing herself to see what was there rather than what she feared. Surgical knowledge, the papers said this repeatedly, not the work of a common criminal, said the police surgeons quoted in print, precision, familiarity with anatomy. She closed the notebook, she opened it again. She asked Mrs. Hartley, casually, over the counter one afternoon, whether the doctor from Lemon Street had been in the area long. Mrs. Hartley, who had opinions about the doctor from Lemon Street that she had been keeping in reserve, produced them now. He had arrived in September. No one seemed to know from where. He had taken the Lemon Street surgery from old Dr. Parker, who'd retired, and had within 2 months established a reputation as a capable physician and a private man. The charitable work at Flower and Dean Street was mentioned in his favour. Beyond that, Mrs. Hartley said, setting down her scissors, nobody knew very much at all. September, Amy turned this over in her mind with the same care she used when handling delicate silk. The murders had begun in August. She thought about his hands. Surgeons' hands, she had noticed this from the beginning, had admired them, the precision of movement and the quality of stillness, the way they rested when he was thinking, as though they were waiting for instructions. She thought about the way he carried the black bag, with a familiarity that was beyond professional habit, a quality of ownership that was almost intimate. She thought about the door ajar and the room behind it. One Tuesday evening, she allowed herself to be walked home by a route that took them past Miller's Court. She had told herself she was simply curious about his reaction. She watched his face in the amber light of the street lamps as they passed the entrance to the court. He did not look away. That was what she noticed. When most people passed Miller's Court, they flinched, they averted, they increased their pace with the unconscious animal instinct to move away from the sight of violence. Jonathan looked at it steadily, as though he were taking a measurement. His jaw moved, a muscle, something small and hard. Does it trouble you? She asked. He was a long moment in answering. Yes, he said at last. In ways I could not explain, She had expected this answer, or something like it. She had not expected the quality of it, the layers beneath the surface, too dense to see through but clearly there, clearly present, making the simple word into something that carried a weight disproportionate to its syllable. She reached home, he said good night. She watched him walk away until the fog received him. She went to her room and opened the blue notebook. She sat with it open on the table before her for a long time without writing anything. Then she wrote, he arrived in September. He knows the streets at night. He carries a medical bag. He has knowledge of anatomy. He has a private room with newspaper cuttings and red circles around dates. He does not flinch at Miller's Court. She read what she had written. Then she wrote one more line, I do not want this to be true. She closed the notebook. She pressed her hands flat on the cover. Outside her window, Whitechapel went about its evening business, indifferent as always, and the fog pressed against the glass like something waiting to be let in. Chapter 8 The Truth. She had not planned to go back to the surgery. She had planned, very carefully, not to go back to the surgery, at least not until she had resolved the question in her mind, by means that did not involve breaking the confidence of a man who trusted her. This was the plan she had arrived at after 3 sleepless nights, and a great deal of conversation with herself about the nature of evidence, the difference between suspicion and knowledge, and the obligations of a woman who was beginning. She permitted herself, finally, to acknowledge this, to love the man in question. It was the letter that changed everything. She found it on a Wednesday morning, when Jonathan had stopped at the shop to bring her a pamphlet about a lecture series at the Institute, a gesture of such characteristic thoughtfulness that it made the knowledge in her stomach clench like a fist. He had left it with Mrs. Hartley, while Amy was in the back room with a fitting, and when she came out, Mrs. Hartley was turning it over with the expression of a woman exercising considerable restraint. Dropped this, did he? Mrs. Hartley handed her the pamphlet. A piece of paper was tucked inside it, not the pamphlet, but something that had been inside Jonathan's coat, and had apparently fallen loose when he reached for the pamphlet. A folded square of cream paper, dense with small handwriting. Amy should have returned it immediately. She knew this, and the knowledge did not stop her. It was a letter, half-finished, begun on one side of the page, the handwriting compressed and very small, the same handwriting, she thought with a lurch of recognition, as the notes she had glimpsed in the red ink on the wall of that back room. Addressed to no one, dated that morning. She read it 3 times standing at the counter. The first time she did not understand what she was reading. The second time she understood, and her mind attempted to reject it, the way a body rejects a foreign substance. The third time she understood completely, and the understanding was physical, a coldness that began in her chest and moved outward to her extremities, a stillness that was nothing like calm. It was not a confession precisely. It was more like an accounting, a meticulous, precise, almost clinical accounting of a mind that had spent a great deal of time examining itself without mercy. It spoke of the double life in terms that were neither boastful nor apologetic, which was in some ways worse than either. It spoke of the compulsion, not excusing it, simply naming it, the way a physician names a disease without claiming to love or hate it. It spoke of the city, of the fog, of the streets at night. And near the end, in handwriting that had changed quality slightly, less compressed, more uncertain, it spoke of a woman who sewed lace hems and walked through Whitechapel as though she had every right to be there, whose laugh in a doorway during rain had interrupted something in him that nothing else had ever touched. Amy stood with the letter in her hands, and the shop bell rang, and a customer came in, and she excused herself to the back room. She sat on the step stool among the bolts of fabric and the spools of thread, and the smell of wool and lavender sachets, and she held the letter in both hands, and she took apart what she knew from what she felt, very carefully, the way she took apart seams that had been sewn wrong. What she knew, the dates, The arrivals in September, the medical bag, the knowledge of anatomy, the room behind the bookcase, the way he looked at Miller's Court. And now this letter that she would have to pretend she had never read or use in a way she could not yet name or carry in her chest like a stone for the rest of however long she had. What she felt, something that she identified, with the honesty that had served her all her life as grief. Not fear, though fear was also present. Grief for the man who brought her books and flowers and paid complete attention to everything she said, for the version of the story that she had been telling herself about him that was now finished, for whatever it was that she had believed was growing between them, which she understood now had been growing in the shadow of something she could not live with. She folded the letter and put it inside the lining of her work bag, next to the blue notebook. She went back to the counter. She served the customer. She sewed for the rest of the afternoon with complete accuracy and not a single thought of what she was doing. At 5 o'clock she told Mrs. Hartley she had a headache and went home. She sat at the table in her room with the letter and the notebook open beside each other, and the room grew dark around her, and she did not light the lamp. Jonathan Blackwood, whom she loved, was Jack the Ripper. She stayed with this sentence for a long time. She looked at it from every angle, the way she looked at a complicated pattern to find where it had gone wrong. It did not go away, it remained what it was. Outside her window, the fog came in from the river, soft and inevitable as everything she could no longer change. Chapter 9 The Confession. She went to him the following evening. She had considered not going. She had considered going to the police, which produced in her a confusion of practical and emotional obstacles so dense that she could not see through it. She had considered simply disappearing, leaving her lodgings, finding work in another part of the city, becoming unreachable. She had given each option serious consideration and put each aside in turn, and what remained when the options had been exhausted was the simple fact that she needed to look at him and ask him directly, because she was not a woman who could carry doubt and accusation in her chest without testing them against the thing itself. She knocked on the door of the surgery at 6 o'clock. It was a cold, still evening, the fog not yet fully risen, the sky above Lemon Street the particular dark blue that exists only briefly before complete dark arrives. Jonathan opened the door and she saw immediately that he knew, not about the letter perhaps, but something. He had the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and has arrived, finally, at the moment when it will. /Amy, her name in his mouth with the care he always gave it. /I think we should talk, she said. He stepped back and let her in. The front room was lit and tidy. She sat. He remained standing by the window as though he might need at some point to turn and look at the street. She took the letter from her bag and placed it on the table between them. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever sat inside. She watched his face and watched it move through several things at once, surprise, and then a kind of relief that she had not expected, and that struck her as the most disturbing part of his reaction, and then something that looked, rawly and without disguise, like pain. You found it, he said. It fell from your coat with the pamphlet. I know I should not have read, No, his voice was very quiet. No, perhaps it is better. He turned from the window. In the lamplight his face was stripped of the reserve she had come to know, and what was underneath it was something she had no ready category for, not the face of a monster, which was what some part of her had been preparing to see, the face of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. Tell me, she said. Not the newspaper's version, tell me yours, He looked at her for a long moment, then he sat down. He spoke for nearly an hour. He did not spare himself. She would remember this always, that he had told her the truth with the same precision he brought to everything, without excuse and without embellishment, and that the precision itself was a kind of horror because it meant she could not dismiss what he said as delusion or exaggeration. He had always known what he was, he told her. Since the age when what he was first made itself clear to him, in a sequence of events rooted in his childhood that he described only briefly, sparing her the details but not the essential truth of them. His father's hands, the things he had been taught about the mechanics of the body and the absence of the soul. He spoke of the years when he had contained it, when the discipline he had built around himself, the precision and the order had been sufficient, The years of medicine which had given the compulsion a channel, a structure, a vocabulary. The years when he had believed he had managed it. And then, Amy said, when his voice had stopped for long enough to indicate that a response was expected. And then, he agreed, something shifted in his expression. I had believed for a very long time that I was not capable of what I felt when I met you, that the thing inside me had displaced it, left no room, he looked at his hands on the table. I was wrong about that, Jonathan, let me finish, his voice was steady, though the effort of making it steady was visible. You are the only person, Amy, in my entire adult life, the only person who has made me feel that what I am is not the only thing I am. And I am aware that this is, I am aware of what you must think of it. I am not telling you this to ask for anything. I am telling you because you asked for the truth, and the truth is that you are the only thing in my life that I have not been able to explain or control or put in a room and lock the door on. The room was very still. From outside came the ordinary sounds of the street, impervious to what was happening inside. Amy sat with everything he had said and did not speak immediately. She had thought, coming here, that the confession would produce clarity, that hearing it directly would resolve the question of what she felt into something simpler. She found, instead, that it had made things more complex in exactly the way she had feared. Because she understood what she had heard, that was what she had not prepared herself for, that she would understand it. Not excuse it, she had no instinct toward excuse, and the weight of the women who had died pressed against her chest like a hand, but understand it, in the same way that she understood the essay on natural philosophy, and the care with which he had marked it, and the look on his face when he spoke of needing the world to be ordered. She understood him, and understanding him did not make what he was acceptable, it only made the loss of what he was not unimaginably, irreversibly larger. The women, she said at last. Her voice was not what she wanted it to be, it was steady, which was more than she'd hoped for, but it lacked the distance she was trying to give it. The women who are dead, yes, you cannot undo them, no, what are we doing here, she heard her own voice as though from a slight distance. What is any of this, Jonathan, He looked at her, and what was in his face was an answer without words. It was, she thought, simply the truth of what he had said, the only thing he had not been able to put in a room and lock the door on, and she understood that this, too, was a kind of answer. It was not sufficient. She knew it was not sufficient. She knew this with absolute certainty, and the certainty was cold and clean and offered her nothing except itself. She rose from the chair. Don't go yet, he said. Not a demand, something more fragile than a demand. I need, she stopped. She tried again. I need to think, Jonathan. I need to think without, I need to think somewhere you are not, He said nothing, she left. Chapter 10, The Impossible Choice. She thought for 2 days. They were the 2 longest days she had lived. She went to work and she came home, and she ate meals, she did not taste and lay awake each night until the small hours and thought, rigorously and without mercy, about everything that was true and everything that could not be changed, and everything that had to happen next. She thought about the women. She kept them in the center of every thought, returning to them whenever she felt herself drift toward the easier, softer version of this, the version in which love was sufficient, in which the man who brought her books and noticed the color of gas lamps was the complete truth of who he was. She would not let herself live in that version. She thought about the women and she was honest. She also thought about the letter she had read, the part about the walk to Victoria Park and the flower seller's cart, the part about the laugh in the doorway. She thought about the chrysanthemums, which were dead in the glass on her windowsill now, but which she had not yet thrown away. She thought about what it meant that she could hold both of these things simultaneously, the grief for the dead and the grief for the man, and that both were real, and neither cancelled out the other, and she had no category for that experience in any moral framework she had been given. He came to the shop on the second day. Mrs. Hartley moved to intercept him, and Amy said, quietly, it's all right. She put on her coat and went out onto the street with him, which was more honest than the consulting room's lamplit privacy had been. He looked worse than she had seen him, not ill, not frightened, but diminished in some way, as though the armature of reserve that held him together was showing strain. He did not pretend. Come with me, he said. She looked at him. I have money enough. I have contacts on the continent who do not know my name here. We could leave tonight, properly leave, Amy, not run but simply begin somewhere that this has not reached. I know what I'm asking. I know what it would cost you, he paused. I know I have no right to ask it, She stood on the pavement in the cold December air and looked at the man who was Jack the Ripper asking her to run away with him, and she found that she was not afraid. This was perhaps the strangest thing she had ever found about herself, that facing the most extreme thing she had ever faced, what she felt was not fear but a terrible, uncomplicated clarity. No, she said. He had expected it. She could see that he had expected it, had not, she thought, truly hoped otherwise, had asked because the alternative was not asking, and not asking was an impossible thing when you had told the truth this completely. Amy, Jonathan, she kept her voice even. There are dead women. There are women who cannot make any choice at all about running or staying or anything else because of what you did. I cannot run, not from that, they will hang me, I know, The words sat between them on the cold pavement. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and what she saw in his face she thought she would carry for the rest of her life. Not anger, not desperation, but a kind of desolate acknowledgement, as though she had confirmed something he had always known would be confirmed, and the knowing of it was both a wound and a completion. Is there nothing, he began. No, she said gently. There is nothing, A cart passed between them briefly. When it was gone he had taken a step back, which was a small thing and a very large thing at the same time. I will not harm you, he said. I want you to know that. Whatever Amy looked at him steadily. I know, she said, and found that she believed it, and found that this belief solved nothing, and found that she no longer expected anything to be solved. She went back inside. She sat at her workstation with her hands in her lap for a long minute before she was able to pick up her work, and Mrs. Hartley did not say anything, which was perhaps the kindest thing she had ever done. Amy thought, I must go to the police. She thought, I must go today. She sat with the needle in her hand and the fabric in her lap, and she thought about what would happen when she told what she knew, and she thought about what would happen if she did not, and both futures arranged themselves before her in the dim shop light, and she understood, with a longing that was almost physical, that she was going to do what was right because it was right, and that it was going to cost her a great deal, and that this was simply the truth of her situation. She would go to the police in the morning. She was not prepared for what the night would bring first. Chapter 11, The Longest Night. She was followed home. She did not realize it immediately. The fog had come in thick and early, one of those December fogs that the newspapers called a pea super and which reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm, and in such a fog the sounds of footsteps carried strangely, bouncing off walls and arriving from unexpected directions. She was 2 streets from her lodgings before she became certain. The footsteps behind her were too consistent. They maintained their distance in a way that random fellow pedestrians did not. They stopped when she slowed, adjusted when she turned. There was an intelligence to them that her body registered before her mind caught up, and when it did catch up, she was already moving faster, her work bag pressed to her side, her eyes fixed on the amber smear of the next lamp. She was not sure it was Jonathan. That was what she held onto as she turned left into Brown's Lane rather than right, choosing the longer route to her lodgings that took her past the pub on the corner. Where she could hear voices through the foggy window, the footsteps followed. She could not be sure she was sure. She thought with a clarity that surprised her given the circumstances, he told me he would not harm me. He said it directly and I believed him. She also thought, he is a man who has done terrible things, and I am walking alone in a fog, and belief is not the same as proof. She turned suddenly into the doorway of a tobacconist's shop, pressing herself into the shadow. The footsteps came forward, slowed, stopped. And Jonathan Blackwood stepped into the amber circle of the gas lamp, and stood with the fog moving around him, and looked at the street. He had not been threatening. She understood this even from the alcove of the doorway, watching his face in the lamplight. He was not hunting. His expression was the expression she had seen most often on him, the quality of careful attention, the measuring look. He was watching the fog the way she was watching him. He was looking for her. She stepped out of the doorway. He turned immediately. She had not made a sound, and he turned as though he had sensed the change in the air, and when he saw her, something in his face moved through several things very quickly and arrived at a place that was difficult to name. Why are you following me? She asked. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. I needed to he stopped. He seemed to be searching for something. I needed to see that you were safe. The word came out with an edge she had not quite intended. From you, Jonathan. You needed to see that I was safe from you. He absorbed this without flinching, which was either dignity or what she had once told herself was his quality of carrying things without putting them down. You said you were going to the police. He said. I said I would not run. She watched his face. I did not specify a timetable. Amy. His voice was, she had not heard it quite like this before, stripped of its careful modulation of the reserve that was his permanent habitat. It was raw. I have spent 2 days trying to he closed his mouth, opened it again. I have been trying to find a version of this that does not end in the way it will end, and I cannot find one. I am not here to stop you. I want you to understand that. I am not here to he stopped again. Why are you here? He looked at her across the fog and the lamplight, and she thought, not for the first time and not without pain, he is the most complicated thing I have ever encountered. Because he said quietly. When I think about not seeing you again, I can't. He shook his head. It does not matter. It is not a reason for anything. No. She agreed. It isn't. They stood in the fog on the empty street. A clock somewhere struck 10. I should take you home. He said finally. You should go away and leave me alone. She said. He did not move. She did not move. The fog swirled between them, indifferent. You be at the shop tomorrow? He asked, and she heard in the question everything it was not asking. Yes. She said. Then I will. He took a breath. Then you should get inside. It is cold and the streets are not. Safe. She said, and left the word where it was. She turned and walked away. She did not look back. She heard his footsteps on the cobblestones, receding this time in the opposite direction, and she walked until she was inside her lodging house, and she locked the door of her room and sat on the bed and pressed her hands together between her knees and held on. She did not sleep that night at all. In the morning she dressed carefully and put the blue notebook in her work bag and the folded letter beside it, and she thought, today I will go to the police, and what happens after that I cannot control. She had her hand on the door of her room when the knock came from outside. Chapter 12. The Final Victim. He was standing in the hallway of her lodging house. She did not understand immediately how he had got past Mrs. Beale's formidable vigilance. Only later would she learn that he had told the landlady he was a physician called on a medical matter, and that Mrs. Beale, confronted with the authority of a well-spoken man in a good coat, had simply stepped aside. This was a thing that would trouble Amy for a long time after, how easily the door opens to those who look as though they belong inside. He was in his dark coat and hat. He was carrying the black bag. His face had an expression she had not seen before, not the reserve, not the rawness of their nighttime conversation, but something else, something that had moved past all of those things to a place she could not follow. It was, she thought, the expression of a man who had worked through all the available mathematics and arrived at a number he did not want but could not argue with. I need you to come with me. He said. His voice was very quiet. She was aware, with precise and animal clarity, that she was alone in a narrow hallway with a man who had killed women in narrow places like this one, and that the object she had been carrying in her work bag as her evidence against him was also her evidence of why she should be afraid of him, and that these two facts existed simultaneously without resolving each other. No. She said. Amy. He took a step forward. She took a step back and her back met the wall and she kept her eyes on his face and refused to look away. backslash I am not going to hurt you. I have told you this and I mean it, but I need you to listen to me, backslash. Backslash I am listening, backslash she said. Backslash I am listening from here, backslash. He stopped. Something moved in his face at her refusal to move, not anger, she noted, not frustration. Something that looked disturbingly like respect. Backslash I am leaving tonight, backslash he said. Backslash I have passage booked from Southampton. I am telling you this because... He looked at the narrow hallway, the wallpaper with its faded flower pattern, the strip of grey morning light under the front door. I needed you to know that I am not making you choose between your conscience and your safety. I am removing the choice, backslash. Amy looked at him, backslash and the evidence, backslash. He was still for a moment. I am gone, it will not matter what you tell them, there will be nothing to prove, backslash. Backslash you would go free, backslash. Backslash yes, backslash. She felt the injustice of this in her chest like a physical thing pressing. She thought about the notebook in her bag and the letter. She thought, if he is gone, the letter is still evidence. The notebook is still a record. The police would have what she had gathered, and what she had gathered pointed clearly, if not conclusively, at a man named Jonathan Blackwood who had taken a surgery on Lemon Street in September 1888 and vanished without notice. Backslash I will still tell them what I know, backslash she said. He looked at her. In the dim hallway, with the grey light under the door and the smell of coal smoke and the distant ordinary sounds of Whitechapel waking to its morning, his face was entirely unguarded. She had never seen him so unguarded. He looked, she thought with a grief that was as clean and simple as anything she had ever felt, like what he might have been if something had gone differently, somewhere long before either of them had any say in it. Backslash I know, backslash he said. Backslash don't, backslash she heard her own voice as though someone else had produced it, steady and final and terribly calm. Backslash whatever you are about to say, don't. There is nothing you can say that I haven't already thought. I have been awake for 2 nights thinking all of it, and at the end of all of it there are still the women, Jonathan. There will always be the women, backslash. He was quiet for a long moment. Backslash yes, backslash he said at last. Backslash there will, backslash. She thought he would leave. The conversation had arrived at its natural end, had reached the point where there was nothing more to say, and the hallway was between him and the door was between him and the street was between him and Southampton and whatever came after. He did not leave. He set the black bag down. It made a small sound on the hallway floor, and the sound was somehow enormous in the silence. He took a single step toward her. Backslash I need you to understand, backslash he said very quietly, backslash, that I know what I am. I have never been anything but clear about that. I am not asking you to forgive what cannot be forgiven. I am asking you to understand that whatever else is true, and a great many terrible things are true, what I feel when I look at you is not part of any of that. It has never been part of that. It is the only thing in my entire life that has been entirely clean, backslash. Amy stood against the wall of the hallway with her work bag on her arm and looked at Jonathan Blackwood, and she understood him. She had always understood him, and understanding had never once made anything simpler, and what she said was true. Backslash I believe you, backslash she said. Backslash and I am still going to tell them what I know, backslash. The grey morning light under the door, the sound of the street. He looked at her for a long time. She did not look away. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket. She tensed. She could not help it. Her body answered the gesture before her mind could reason past it, and she pressed back against the wall and put her hand on the bag with the notebook inside and told herself she would not make it easy for him. She would scream, she would fight, she would not. He placed something on the small table beside the door, a folded piece of paper. Backslash a letter, backslash he said. Backslash to no one in particular, I wrote it last night, backslash he looked at her, and his eyes were dark and steady and entirely level. Backslash you may give it to the police or you may burn it or you may keep it for yourself. I leave that to your judgment, which I have always found considerably better than my own, backslash. He picked up the black bag. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the knob and did not immediately turn it. She could see the back of his neck, the collar of his coat, the hat that had been in a doorway during rain on a night that felt like it had happened in a different life. Backslash Amy, backslash. Backslash Jonathan, backslash. He turned the knob. The door opened on the grey Whitechapel morning, the fog still sitting low along the street, the gas lamps still lit and fading in the growing daylight. He walked out. She watched through the narrow window beside the door as he moved along the street, steady, unhurried, purposeful as he had always moved. The fog received him in pieces, first his feet, then his coat, then the brim of his hat, then the hat itself, and then there was nothing but the street and the fog and the gas lamp still burning orange in the grey morning light. She stood in the hallway for what seemed like a long time. Then she picked up the letter from the table and held it. Then she sat down on the bottom stair in the hallway of her lodging house in Whitechapel, and she pressed the letter against her chest and she wept, not for herself, though there was grief for herself too, and she would not deny it. Not only for the women, though she wept for them most of all, and she would carry them always. But for the terrible, unresolvable truth that a person could be both more than one thing and precisely one thing, could contain love and horror in the same hands, could be irredeemably lost and genuinely, completely, heartbreakingly found, all at the same time. She wept until she was finished. Then she stood up and put the letter in her bag and went to the police station on Commercial Street. It was the morning of the 14th of December, 1888. It was the last time Amy Whitmore or anyone else would see Jonathan Blackwood on the streets of Whitechapel. It was not, however, the last time anyone would hear of Jack the Ripper. But that is a different kind of story. Epilogue: The Unsolved Mystery. The Metropolitan Police received Miss Amy Whitmore's statement on the morning of the 14th of December, 1888. They also received the letter Jonathan Blackwood had left on the table beside the door, which Amy had chosen, after some reflection that she did not describe to anyone, to hand over, and which the police read with great attention and then placed in a file that was subsequently lost during an administrative reorganization in 1891. The file was not found again until 1934, and by then the men who had read it were dead, and the woman who had given it to them had been dead for 22 years, and the events it described had passed so entirely into mythology that the file's contents were evaluated not as a record of an investigation, but as one more piece of a legend that had outgrown the need for facts. The Lemon Street surgery of Jonathan Blackwood was examined, his instruments were found and catalogued, his medical records were reviewed, his neighbours were interviewed. Everyone agreed that he had been a private man of obvious education and genuine professional ability. No one could say where he had come from or where he had gone. His name did not appear in any record of a Southampton passage for December 1888, but a passenger list for a vessel departing from Tilbury docks on the 15th of December contained the name J. Black, and this coincidence was noted and then set aside when the investigation moved in other directions. Investigations in the Whitechapel murders continued officially for several more years. Various suspects were named, examined, and found insufficiently evidenced. The file was never formally closed. No one was ever charged. Amy Whitmore remained in Whitechapel for 3 more years, and then moved to Hackney, where she opened a small tailoring business that employed 6 women and was considered a model of the kind of enterprise the charitable societies of the period tried to encourage. She was known in her neighbourhood and among her customers as a woman of particular quietness and particular warmth, precise in her work, kind in her dealings, possessed of a quality that people described variously as serenity and sadness, and sometimes both, as though the two were not so different as they were commonly supposed to be. She never married. She kept a diary, which was found by her niece after her death in 1912, and was, for reasons the niece was not able to fully articulate, placed in a trunk rather than destroyed. The trunk was moved 3 times over the following decades and was eventually donated, among other effects, to a local historical society in 1947. The diary was not examined closely until 1971, when a researcher named Dr. Patricia Holt was cataloguing the society's holdings and opened it to find not the domestic record she expected, but something considerably more complex. A 23-year account of a woman's interior life, written in small, careful handwriting, whose entries became increasingly interested, from December 1888 onward, in questions of guilt and knowledge and the obligations of the living toward the dead. At the back of the diary, sewn into the lining of the cover with a seamstress's invisible stitch, Dr. Holt found a folded piece of cream paper. The paper was dense with small, compressed handwriting that was not Amy Whitmore's. It was a letter addressed to no one, It described, in the spare, precise language of a man accustomed to clinical accounting, a double life in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. It mentioned, near its end, a woman who sewed lace hems and walked through fog as though she had every right to be there. Dr. Holt published a paper about her discovery in 1972. The paper attracted attention in specialist circles and was largely forgotten outside them. A subsequent researcher, reviewing the same materials in 1989, concluded that the letter was not conclusive evidence of anything, that the handwriting could not be definitively matched to any known sample, and that the account, while compelling, relied entirely on the credibility of a woman who was not available to be cross-examined. The letter was returned to the trunk was returned to the archive was moved in 2003 to a new facility in East London, where it remains. The blue notebook which Amy had kept throughout that autumn and winter was not among the materials she gave to the police. It was not among the materials in the trunk. It has never been found. There is one final entry in Amy Whitmore's diary, written on the 14th of December, 1888, the day she went to the police station on Commercial Street. The entry is brief. I have done what was right. I believe that I have done what was right. I will spend the rest of my life being certain that I have done what was right, and the certainty will not answer the question I am left with, which is not whether I did what was right, but whether what was true between us was true. He said he loved me. He said it in the way people say things they have no hope of being believed, which is without asking to be believed. I find I cannot dismiss this. I find I cannot accept it either. Perhaps this is what he intended. Perhaps this is the last thing he did to me. Perhaps it is the only entirely honest thing he ever gave anyone. I do not know. I have been wrong before. I have been right before. I walked through the fog all autumn and arrived here, and here is where I am, and the question he left with me is one I will carry until I cannot carry anything. Was it love? God forgive me, I think it might have been. E.W. December 14, 1888. Jonathan Blackwood was never found. The Whitechapel murders were never solved. And somewhere in the fog of history, between the fact and the legend, between the documented and the unknowable, a woman sewed lace hems and walked through the dark and tried to understand how a single person could contain both the darkest thing and the clearest thing she had ever known. Whether Jack the Ripper truly loved Amy Whitmore, or whether she was simply the last woman he destroyed by other means, is a question that the fog of October 1888 has kept, and intends to keep for itself.